Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video in Raid Shadow Legends. In this video, I will be going over all of the various buffs and debuffs that are available in the game and what they do. First, we'll be looking at the beneficial effects that you can place on your own team, more commonly referred to as buffs. The first run of buffs we'll be looking at will increase some of your champion's battle stats, which are the champion's total stat values after their base stats, artifact increases, and aura increases have been added up. These buffs have two different versions of the stat increase, which sometimes can be improved to the higher version through Ascension, but most of the times cannot be changed. Increased attack is indicated by either a single sword for the lesser version or two crossed swords for the greater version. This buff increases your champion's attack stat value by either 25% or 50% depending on which version of the buff the champion has. Increased crit rate is shown by either a fist for the lesser version or a fist with these exclamatory triangles to make it appear more powerful. This buff increases your champion's crit rate by either 15% or 30%. Next is the increased defense buff, which is shown by a shield for the lesser version, which increases your champion's defense stat by 30%, and the more powerful version of this buff is shown by two side-by-side shields with a third shield in front. This version increases the defense stat by a whole 60%. The last of these stat increasing buffs is increased speed. This buff is illustrated by a boot for the lesser version, giving a 15% speed increase, or a boot with wings for the greater version, giving a 30% speed increase. The next few buffs do not increase champion stats, but they still do have two different versions of the buff. The first of these buffs is Ally Protection, and it is shown by two hands holding each other, with or without the triangle exclamations to differentiate between the two different versions. The champion that casts this buff takes 25 to 50% of the direct damage that is inflicted to the target champion. Each champion uses their respective defense values for mitigating the damage. The next buff we'll be looking at is Reflect Damage, which is shown by a shield with either one or two arrows bouncing off of it. This buff will inflict 15% to 30% of the attacking champion's damage back at them when attacking a champion with this buff applied. The last buff with two different versions is the Continuous Heal buff. This buff is indicated by either a small cross or a bigger cross, and this buff heals the target champion by either 7.5% or 15% of their own max HP at the start of their turn. The last few buffs available in the game each only have one version, but are pretty powerful buffs. Counterattack is shown by two swords side by side but facing opposite directions. When a champion has the counterattack buff applied and is attacked, they will retaliate against their attacker using their default skill, dealing 75% of their normal damage. The champion will only counterattack once from a multi-hit skill, and will not counterattack from another counterattack. The counterattack itself does not count as a turn, so a champion can counterattack several times in between their turn while not affecting buff and debuff counters. Block Buffs is the next buff we'll look at and is shown by a shield with a heart inside of it. While this buff is active, this champion is immune to all debuffs. Instant negative effects such as decreased turn meter and steal buffs are not affected and they still work as normal. Block Damage is next, and it is indicated by a flexing character. This buff simply makes the champion immune to all forms of damage. Unkillable is shown by a profile view of a Trojan helmet, and allows the champion to take damage as normal, but will not allow them to fall below 1 HP for the duration of the buff. For those without the Unkillable buff, a nice replacement might be Revive on Death, which is shown by a Phoenix Rising. If the champion with this buff dies, they will immediately be revived with 30% HP and 0% turn meter. The last buff that can be applied to a champion is Shield, and it is illustrated by a shield with a blue half and a white half. The champion's HP bar is reinforced for a specific amount of turns with the shield effect. Damage to this champion is calculated normally, but is first applied to the shield instead of the champion's HP. When the buff expires or the shield value reaches 0, further damage is applied as normal. Damage dealt to the shield does not count as damage dealt to the champion, so effects such as lifesteal do not benefit from it. Next, we'll be looking at a list of debuffs available to affect enemy champions. While buffs are always applied to your own champions without fail, debuffs have two different ways that can make the desired effects not apply to the enemy. In a lot of cases, your champion's skill will state that there's a % chance of placing the specific debuff. In Royal Guard's A3 skill, each hit has a 60% chance of placing its debuff. In other cases like Outlaw Monk, his A2 skill states that it just outright places the debuff, without specifying a % chance of it working. This is the first check that your debuff will go through, and once the game has decided if the debuff landed on the enemy, it's time to see if the debuff will stick. The second chance for debuffs relates to your champion's accuracy stat and your enemy's resistance stat. If your accuracy is too low, or your enemy's resistance is too high, or you just have a bad RNG roll, your enemy will resist the debuff even if the first check was in your favor. But if your opponent fails to resist the debuff, then it will stick and they will have to deal with the effects. Now that we've gone over the basics of applying debuffs, let's take a look at all the ways that you can make your enemy's champions miserable. The first couple of debuffs we'll look at are similar to the first buffs we went over, and they will affect the champion's battle stats. The lesser version of decreased accuracy is shown by a crosshair that reduces the champion's accuracy by 25%. The greater version looks like a crosshair with some extra flourish around it, and it reduces the champion's accuracy by 50%. Decreased attack is next, and it is a mirror to the buff version. It will reduce the champion's attack stat by 25 to 50%, depending on the version. The weaker is illustrated by a single broken sword, while the more powerful version is a broken sword crossed by another sword. The next stat affecting debuff is the speed version. The lesser version of decreased speed is a broken boot, and it applies a 15% decrease to speed, while the greater version is a 30% decrease and it looks like a broken boot with wings. If you're looking to do more damage to the enemy, look no further than decreased defense or weaken. Decreased defense is shown by either a single broken shield or a broken shield with two more shields behind it. The lesser debuff provides a 30% decrease in the defense stat, while the more powerful debuff decreases by 60%. Instead of affecting champion stats, weaken is a debuff that just outright increases damage that the target receives by either 15% or 25%. The weak version is shown by a skull and crossbones, while the strong version is a skull and crossbones on fire. The next debuffs still have two different versions, but like weaken, they do not affect champion stats. Hueber Reduction will reduce the amount of healing a champion receives by either 50% or 100%. The weak version of the debuff is a cross with one chain across it, while the strong version is a cross with two chains across it. Poison is the last debuff with two different versions, and it damages the target by either 2.5% or 5% of their max HP at the beginning of their turn. The lesser version looks like a potion with a bubble effect on it, while the greater version looks like a potion with a skull in it. There is a similar debuff to poison that only has one version of it, and it's called HP burn. Unlike poison, which only affects the champion with the debuff on it, HP burn will damage every champion on the team by 3% of their respective max HPs at the beginning of the affected champion's turn. This debuff can only have one debuff applied at a time, unlike poison, which can have multiple debuffs stacked at a time. Next is the bomb debuff, which is shown by a bubbly squared potion. When this debuff expires, the affected champion suffers direct damage that ignores their defense value. The Leach debuff is next, and it looks like a water or blood drop, and it allows any champion that attacks the affected champion to heal 10% of any damage they deal. This debuff that looks like a brick shield on fire is the Block Buffs debuff. This debuff makes all buffs applied to the affected champion have no effect. Another block type debuff is block cooldown skills, which prevents champions from using any active skills other than their default skill for the duration of the debuff. This debuff appears as a lock. The last type of debuff available are CC buffs, or crowd control, which limits the ability of a champion to act as they normally would. The first of these is Provoke, which looks like a bull, and makes the affected champion only attack the champion that applied the debuff, using only their default skill. The sleep debuff appears as 3 Zs, and will make the affected champion unable to act for the specified amount of turns, as well as not allow skills to reduce their cooldowns. This debuff will automatically be removed if the affected champion receives any damage. The stun debuff looks like a vortex and will have the exact same effect as sleep, but will not be removed prematurely by damage done to the champion. The last CC debuff is the freeze debuff, which is shown by a snowflake and will have the same effect as sleep and stun, but the affected champion will only receive 75% of the incoming damage. The last thing we need to go over is the special buff and debuffs that you will only encounter in the Minotaur's Labyrinth. Rage is a buff that the Minotaur will have that gives him an extra 400% damage. After the Rage buff has expired, the Minotaur will receive the Dazed debuff. This debuff will give the damage your champions deal an extra 200% damage. Lastly, the Minotaur will also place a debuff on your team called Hex, which once again increases the amount of damage the Minotaur does to your team. Specifically, the Hex debuff makes the Minotaur's Tremor Stomp skill deal double damage. Thanks for sticking with me through this longer video, and I hope this cleared up any questions that you may have had about the buffs and debuffs in Raid Shadow Legends. If you would like to have a discussion about buffs and debuffs, or have any suggestions on future videos, leave a comment. And if you liked the video or thought it was informative, a like would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.